All right, so now we're going to look at a method called reduce, which is used to reduce your array down to a single value. And this can be a little tricky to grasp. At least for me, it was a little trickier than some of the others. But a good use case for this and a good example is a shopping cart where you might have an array of products with different prices, and you want to reduce that down to a total of the prices for your shopping cart. That's somewhere where you'll see reduce a lot. So if we look at this example here, very simple example, there's three arguments that I want you to understand here. So basically, reduce takes in a function just like the rest of them. And there's two arguments here, previous value and current value. So previous value is basically what's returned from the last iteration or the last function that ran, last callback. This is also called the accumulator. So if you hear accumulator and previous value, those are both usually mean the same thing. And then the current value is whatever the current element we're on, okay? And then you can also pass in, as an additional argument here, the initial value, which is whatever you want the initial previous value to be, because obviously your first loop through, you're not going to have a previous value. So you can set that here. And in most cases, it's going to be set to 0. All right, so let's look at a very similar example, and then I'll show you like a shopping cart example. So let's say we have an array of just numbers, and we'll just use 1 to 10. Okay, and then I want to get the sum of all of these numbers. So I'm going to create a variable called sum, and let's use reduce on the numbers array. And like I said, it's going to take in a function just like the rest of these array methods. And actually, let's do a long version of the function first, just to kind of give you a better idea of what's going on. So the function will take in either the previous value or accumulator. I usually use accumulator, and then the current value. All right, and then to set the initial value, which isn't actually required, but if you want to set that, you can add it after the curly braces here. And let's say 0, set that to 0. Whoops. And then in here, what I want to do is return the accumulator. So every time this runs, I'm going to take the accumulator or the previous value and add it to the current value. And that should, in the end, give us a sum of all the numbers. So let's come down here and console log sum. And let's go to our console. And you see we get 55. So basically, it started at 0, because that's what we set here. Then it went through, ran a function for each element, took the previous value. So for instance, when it was on 2, it took 1, and then added the current value. So it added 2. Then the function ran again for the next element, and it took 3 and added the previous item or value, which is 2. And it kept doing that until we're done with the array. All right, and then of course you can shorten it up, and we could say const sum equals numbers dot reduce, and pass in here an arrow function. And you could shorten it up to like ACC is commonly used, and then CURR or CUR for current value. And then we could just say we want the accumulator plus the current value. And then for the initial value, we'll pass in 0. And let's just change the variable name to sum2, and we'll console log sum2, and we should get the same thing. Now, if I take this initial value and I set that to, let's say, 10, and then I save that and run it, you'll see we get 65. And the reason for that is because now we're starting at 10, okay? Before we do anything, we're starting at 10, and that's what this accumulator is going to be on the first run through. So now we're going to get 10 more than we normally would. Okay, so I just want you to understand what these arguments are. Now, to make this even a little more clear, I'm going to do this with a for loop. So we'll say using a for loop, because there's so many different ways to do the same thing. And if you were to use a for loop instead of reduce, that's not wrong at all. It's just a little longer. So I'll even put this into a function. We'll use a function expression. So I'll say const sum3, and then set that to a function. So I'm going to initialize the accumulator. So we'll initialize that at 0, and then we'll do a for loop. And I'm actually going to use a for of since we're going through an array. So we can say const, and we can call this number, or we can even call it CUR like we did above, of numbers, because that's the name of the array. And then all we have to do is set the accumulator equal to the accumulator plus the current value. Okay, now an easier way to do this, or a shorter way to do this, is to use the plus equals syntax. We can just do that. All right, and then outside of the for loop, we'll go ahead and return whatever the accumulator is. And now if I come down here and I run a console log of sum3, whoops, this is a function. We need to make sure we add the parentheses, and now you can see we get 55. Okay, and there's just so many ways to do this. You could even do this same kind of thing within a for each. So hopefully that kind of puts this into perspective a little bit. Now, a more realistic example would be to have a shopping cart. So let's do that. We'll say we have this cart, which is an array of products. We'll say, let's give it an ID. We'll say ID, and then name product 1, and then a price. Price, we'll say 130. And then let's say we have 3 products. So this will be 2, 3, and product 2, product 3, and then the pricing, let's do 150 and then 175. All right, so if you want to pause the video and try to use reduce to get the total of these prices, then you can do that now. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable of total and set that to cart.reduce. And we could either pass in a short arrow function, or we could do the long way, which I'm going to do here. And this is going to take in the accumulator, and it's going to take in the current value. Now, instead of using like CUR or current value, I'm just going to put in product, because that's what it is, right? We're looping through these products, and each value is going to be a product. So that makes more sense to me. And then we're going to just return from here the accumulator plus. Now, if I just do product, right, because that's what we did up here, we just plus the current value. It's not going to work here because these are objects. These the actual elements that we were looping through and running the function on were the numbers we were adding. In this case, it's a property of price. So you want to make sure that here you add dot price. All right, and then for the initial value, we'll set that to 0. And now if I go ahead and console log the total, we get 455. Okay, if I add, let's make this 200 and save, now it's 480. So this is something that's extremely common with things like shopping carts. All right, so that's reduce. Now there are other high order array methods, and I want to get to those. But I know that some of you are dying to just start to work with the DOM and actually put things in the browser and work with events and stuff. So we'll get to some of the other ones later when we can actually implement DOM elements. But before we do that, I just want to give you a couple challenges in the next video.